We continue now at the top of Daf Vav Amud Aleph Meseches Bava Kamma. This is Bava Kamma Daf 106a. This Daf is sponsored by David Grossman. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you'd like to sponsor an Amud or a Daf, please take a look at the description box below and see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was making a distinction within Rav Sheshes and saying that according to Rav Sheshes, if a person denies a pikadon and they have the pikadon in their possession, that's considered like a gazela. At that moment, they are a gazlan and they're chayav ba'onsin. However, if the person denies a pikadon and the pikadon is not currently in their possession, so then they might just be delaying because they're trying to locate that pikadon, and in such a situation, they would not be considered a gazlan at the moment of their denial. And the Gemara is proving this distinction from a statement of Ravidi Bar Avin, because Ravidi Bar Avin says that if a person denies a loan, so in that situation, they might just be trying to buy time in order to pay back the loan. They're not considered to be a gazlan. However, the pikadon, if they deny a pikadon, pasul le'eda, so then they are disqualified to be an aid, because there again, it is considered to be like a gazela. And Rashi explains, "Bepikadon pasal le'edus umukminan la b'reish shnayim ochzin." We say that it's talking in the beginning of Perek Shnayim Ochzin. We say that it's talking kagon, for example, to Amri Sahadi, that the witnesses say dahi shaita de kafar le naked biyade, that at the moment that he's denying it, he really has possession of it. Umifsal, and therefore he's disqualified alpha gav de lo ishtaba, even though there is no oath. De'ibe ishtaba, because if the situation is there was a false oath, mali milva mali pikadon, what difference would it make if it was a loan or pikadon? The fact that we're making this distinction, obviously we're talking about a denial without taking that false oath. And the Gemara continues, V'amar ilfa, but didn't ilfa say, Shavua kona, that an oath is kona? Rashi says, Shavua kona kasal kadaydach. Right now we think it means, L'hischaya b'onsim. It means that if you take a false shvua, it's kona, meaning you acquire it, that you're now chayiv in onsin. You have a certain responsibility, even if an onus happens. Misha shenishbar l'sheker kamma, from the moment that he swore falsely, he is then chayiv. So then it sounds like really it's the shvua that creates the obligation, the chayiv in onsin, and not just the denial. That's the question from ilfa. Shavua hi dekanya, it's the shvua that creates the kinyan. Avol kfira lo kanya, but when it comes to just the denial, that's not enough to create the kinyan. And the Gemara says to that, Hachanami, here also we can answer as we did before. The Kamma ba'agam, there it's talking about a situation where it's in the swamp, meaning it's not in the person's possession. So in those situations, the denial alone is not enough to make the person a gazlan, because again, maybe they're just buying some time. But the shvua, the false shvua, would in fact make the person a gazlan. V'boy Seman, if you want, I could say another answer. Mai shvua kona. What does it mean when Ilfa said shvua kona? Kid Rav Huna, it's just like what Rav Huna said. The Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav, because Rav Huna said that Rav said, Mana li biyarcha, if a person says a mana of mine is in your hands, you owe me a mana. V'halo Amar, the other one says, Ein lach biyadi, so I don't have it. V'nishba, and then he swears, v'yachar kach bo edim, and then edim come. In that case, we say pater. In that case, we say he is exempt. Shenemar, as it says, v'lokach ba'olav v'lo yishalem, kevan shekiblu habaylam shvua. It means to say from this pasuk, once the owners accept the shvua, shuv ein meshalem mammon. So then he no longer pays mammon, he no longer pays money. And Rashi explains, V'iba yisema shvua kona. If you want, I could say that what does it mean, shvua kona, de kamar ilfa? What does it mean, the shvua kona that ilfa says? Legamri kamar. It means that the shvua is totally kona, meaning the sulo mashali, meaning to say that he no longer pays, Kid Rav Huna, as Rav Huna explains. And we will take a look at the full pasuk that Rav is talking about. Shvuas Hashem tia bein shneim. The full pasuk is there's a shvua between them. This is talking about again a case of a pikadon, where the person who is watching over the pikadon is denying responsibility. So he takes a shvua im lo shalach yadu b'meleches re'ehu, that he didn't send forth his hand, he didn't do anything wrong in terms of watching this pikadon. V'lokach ba'olav v'lo yishalem. So then the owners have to acquiesce, and he's not going to have to pay. And so the chiddush of Rav, meaning the chiddush of Rav Huna Amar Rav, is that even if Edom come later and say, really, this person who was watching the pikadon is responsible, he's going to be pater, because once the bailam accept a shvua, he no longer pays money. And the Gemara now discusses this statement of Rav. The Gemara says, Gufa, returning to what we just said above, Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav, Rav Huna said that Rav said, Mana li biyadcha, if a person says again, you owe me a mana, v'halo omer ein lach biyadi klum, and the other one says, I don't owe you anything, v'nishban, he takes a shvua, ubo edim, and again, edim come pater, he's going to be pater. Shenemar, as it says, v'lakach ba'olav v'lo yishalem, the bailam have to accept the shvua, and he's not going to have to pay anything. Again, the reason why we brought this in is to say, maybe this is what Ilfa meant when he said shvua kona, it's kona, and kevan shekiblu bailam shvua, once the owners accept the shvua, shuvein meshalem and mammon, there no longer is a payment of mammon. And so the Gemara now analyzes this statement of Rav. Amar Rava says, Mistavra Milse de Rav, it makes sense to say that this word, that this psak of Rav is b'milvis, specifically talking about a loan, to l'hot sanin, because that's something that is meant to be spent. You take the money, you borrow it, you use it, then you pay back other money. Avol pikadon, but when we're talking about a pikadon, b'reshuse demari koi, that already is in the possession of the original owner. So of course he has to return it. Even if Adam would later, even if he took a shvua, he's still going to have to return what essentially belongs to the original owner. But the Gemara says, V'alokim, but by God, Amar Rav afilu b'pikadon. Rav said it even by pikadon. And how do we know that? Dechi ksiv kra b'pikadon ksiv, because the whole pasuk that's being brought is actually talking about pikadon. So you can't say that he actually said this halacha even by a pikadon. And the Gemara says, Yosef Rav Nachman Amar l'Hashmaiter. Rav Nachman was sitting, he said over this teaching, he said over this halacha. Eisvei Rav Acha bar Menyume Rav Nachman. Rav Acha bar Menyume asked Rav Nachman the following question. Let's say we have a case, Heichon Piktoni, where somebody says, where is my pikadon? Give me back my pikadon. Amar le'avid, he said, it's lost, I'm not responsible. Mashbiachani, he said, I want you to take an oath about it. V'yamar Amen, he says, Amen, he takes the oath. V'o'edem mi'idem oso sha'achlu, and then Edom come in and say, no, this person actually consumed it, he ate it, he owes money for it. Meshalim esakeren, so then he does have to pay the principal. Already it seems to go against Rav. It says he pays. Hoda me'atzmo. Now, if he admitted that he took a false oath, Meshalim keren v'chomesh v'yosham, that's the case where he pays the principal and a fifth and brings a carbon asham, as we discussed earlier. And the Gemara says, Amar le Rav Nachman, so Rav Nachman said back, because Rav Nachman had said over this halacha, and now we have a question on this halacha. And so Rav Nachman responds, Hacha b'mai askin, on here in this Mishnah, what are we talking about? Kegon denishba chutz lebezin. The case over here was that he did take a shvua, but it wasn't a shvua in bezin, it was a shvua outside of bezin. When you have a shvua outside of bezin, so that's not going to create an exemption, and when the Edom come, he is going to have to pay in that case. The Gemara says, Amar le said to me, Hachi, if so, I'm a sefer. Let's look at the end of the Mishnah. It says, Heichon Pigdoni, where's my pikadon? Amar lo nignav, he says that it was stolen. Mashbiachani, he says, I want you to take a shvua. V'yamar amen, and he says, amen, he takes the shvua. V'edem mi'edem osav shaganvu, and then the Edom testified that he's the one that stole it. Meshalim tashlum kefil, he has to pay the double payment of a ganav. Hodem me'atzman, now if he admits, Meshalim karen v'chomesh v'yasham, he pays the principal in a fifth, and he brings a carbon asham. And so the Gemara says to this, V'salka daita chutz lebezin, if you think this Mishnah is talking about outside of Bezdin, mi'ika kefil, then there wouldn't be kefil. Would there be kefil in such a situation? The fact that there's kefil, that indicates we're talking about in Bezdin. And again, if he took the shvua in Bezdin, we see from here that even though he took the shvua, if Edom come, he has to pay. So Amar Lei, so he said back to him, Yachilna l'shanu yelach. I could answer this question to you by saying, Reisha chutz lebezin, that in the Reish in the beginning of the Mishnah, we're talking about outside of Bezdin. V'seifa bebezin, and indeed you're correct that in the Seifa of the Mishnah, at the end of the Mishnah, we're talking about in Bezdin. They're talking about two different scenarios altogether. Miu, nevertheless, I don't want to give you a dochik answer, a forced answer. Rather, we'll answer as follows: Idi v'idi bebezin. Both of them are talking about in bezin, and the difference is v'lo kash. It's not difficult. Kan b'kafetz. In one case, he jumped and took the shvua early. Kan b'shalo kafetz. In the other case, he didn't jump and take the shvua early. And we will take a look at Rashi. At first, Rava said that Rav was talking specifically to lahotzanin, and he was talking specifically about loans which are meant to be spent. And that's where Rav said that when he takes the shvua, he's pater, even if Edom come later. Uboy tashlumin, because when it comes to a loan, it's a requirement to pay. You have to pay back. V'ikol lemeimar devishvua ifter leimit tashlumin. So you could say that when he takes an oath, he's now exempt from that payment. K'dichsiv v'lo yeshalim, like it's phrased in the pasuk, it's written and he doesn't pay. But avol b'pikadon. But when it comes to a pikadon, b'reshusei demari kai, so that's already in the possession of the original owner. If he ain't kind of v'lo yeshalim, you can't apply the pasuk of v'lo yeshalim to hakol heicha de'isa demari, wherever it is, it belongs to the owner. So Rava wanted to say that Rav wouldn't go so far as to say that he wouldn't have to return the pikadon. The Gemara said no, it's not true. Rav said it even by pikadon. B'pikadon ksiv gabe shomer sachar. It's written by pikadon by shomer sachar. And so then Rav Nachman said over l'hashmaita de Rav Huna. He said over this teaching of Rav Huna from Rav meshalim es hakeren. So then we asked Rav Nachman, because we bring this Mishnah that says that he has to pay the keren. V'kefel lo. Now he doesn't have to pay kefel in this case. De'in kefel el b'toy nignav. Because again, when we bring the Mishnah, the first case of the Mishnah is that he says it was lost, and then the person says take a shvua, he takes a shvua, and the Edom come and they say that it's really his fault, sha'achlo, that he's the one that consumed it. So then it says he pays the keren, and Rashi's pointing out over here, he doesn't pay kefel in this situation, because you don't pay kefel unless the original claim was not that it was lost, it has to be that it was stolen. The chomesh v'yasham nami lo shaychi ela kasho, then of course you don't pay the fifth and the yasham, because that's not by Edom, that's only when there's an admission. Techsiv begezel hager v'svadu, it talks about admission over there by gezel hager. Hoda me'atzmo, that's why it says that if he admits la'achar shvua, after he takes the oath, he admits it was a false oath, so then he's going to pay the Karen, the Chomesh, and the Yasham. In any case, though, it is a question because it says that if the Eidim testify, he has to pay. Katani miyaresha mashalim Karen al yedei Eidim. It says in the beginning of the Mishnah, he pays the Karen through Eidim, even though he took the oath. V'kasha l'Rav. That's difficult to Rav. Damar kevan shenishba lo yeshalim. Rav says once an oath is taken, there's no more payment. Afilu bo Eidim, even if Eidim come. And Rashi points out, now we're not going to ask from the end, from the last line where it says that if he admits he has to pay Karen, Chomesh, and Asham, to Vahoda lo Kamma Rav, because Rav was never talking about a case of an admission. There Rav would certainly admit you have to pay. It says Beferish in the Pasuk, he has to return the Gazela, which is specifically talking about a case where he takes the oath and then he admits. So that's not even a question on Rav, because Rav never said it by admission. And so the Gemara initially answered, Chutz leBezdin, we're talking about an oath that was taken outside of Bezdin, Lo alima shvua lafkoim memona. That is not such a strong shvua that now he doesn't have to pay the money. But then the Gemara said, but what about the Seifa? Because in the Seifa, clearly we're talking about in Bezdin, because we're talking about a payment of kefil. And then the Gemara answered, instead of answering that we're talking about outside of Bezdin in the first part of the Mishnah and inside Bezdin in the second part of the Mishnah, instead the Gemara answered a difference between kafatz and keshelo kafatz. And Rashi explains, kan kafatz bereisha, meaning in the first case where he says that it was lost, and then it says he takes the shvua and he eventually pays when Eidim come. That's talking about the shvua that was taken was kafatz. It was he jumped and took it early. The katani mishalim kishakafatz. When it says he has to pay kishakafatz zev hishbio, that's when he made him take a shvua. Kodem shechayvu bezin, before bezin actually obligated him. In other words, before bezin said chayiv, before that point in time he took a shvua. V'chi ka'amar Rav, and what was Rav talking about? That's below kafatz. That's talking about a situation where he didn't jump and take it early. V'hadayon in hishbio, and it was the judges that made him take the shvua. V'kanya osa shvua dekra b'shvuas hadayonim ksiv, and then in that case it's going to be an acquisition because the shvua, the pasuk is talking about the shvuas hadayon, and so it's essentially very similar to the answer before of outside of bezin. But the Gemara is essentially saying in the reisha the case is that he took the shvua before bezin actually administered the shvua. That's why it doesn't exempt him in that case. Now, even though at the end of the Mishnah you can't say we're talking about kafatz where he took the shvua early, because there we're talking about the katani kefil, because there we're talking about a kefil payment. The kefil lo isei ela b'shvuas hadayon. The halacha actually is that kefil only applies when you have a shvuas hadayonim, a shvua from the judges. So we're still back to saying you can't say that. But nevertheless, we're going to make that distinction. That again, the reisha is talking about kafatz. That's why we say kan b'shakafatz, kan b'shalo kafatz. The reisha is talking about where he takes the shvua early, and the Sefer is talking about a situation where he doesn't. Rashi just says that the Gemara would prefer to say that we're talking about everything taking place in Bezdin, but it's just different scenarios of when the shvua took place. So the Reish is when he took it early, he took the shvua on his own early, and the Sefer he took it from the judges. Even though we're making a distinction between Reish and the Sefer, that distinction is not so bad. It's much worse to make a distinction and say that the Reish of the Mishnah is talking about outside of Bezdin in a different location altogether, and the Sefer of the Mishnah is talking about inside of Bezdin. That we don't want to say. Now Rashi also points out, V'seifa lo kasha le Rav. Now why don't we just ask the question from the case of the Seifa? That also should be a question on Rav. Because what's the case of the Seifa? The case of the Seifa is he says, you owe me my pikadon. The person says it was stolen. The only difference is he says it was stolen instead of saying it was lost. Then he takes a shvua, and then the Eidim testify, and so then we say the Eidim testify, he has to pay the kefil. Well, if the Eidim are testifying and he has to pay the kefil, that also goes against Rav, because Rav said that if you take a shvua, and in this case we're saying that the shvua was with dayanim, the shvua was a shvua administered by the judges, so Rav said that should exempt you. So why is he paying the kefil in the Seifa? We have a question from the Seifa on Rav. So Rashi says that's not a difficult to Rav. Because even though it says he pays kefil, after he's taken an oath, v'chol sheken Karen, if he's paying kefil, certainly he pays the Karen, the principal. It's not a question, because Rav would never say it if the claim was made that it was stolen. There Rav would admit, he admits l'kamon later on, b'shmait, and later on the sugya, the shvua, the kamechayev lekefil, lo mekanya lekarna, because you have an oath. Now the oath by definition is what actually is being mechayev the kefil in this case. So you're not going to say that the same shvua, which is mechayev the kefil by toin tainas ganev, is also going to exempt him from the Karen. That you certainly would not say. That's why Rav admits in that case, and we're not asking from the Seifa. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rami bar Chama le Rav Nachman. Rami bar Chama said to Rav Nachman, Michdi, let us see. The Rav lo svirlach, you don't hold like Rav. Meshchune nafshachad Rav lamalach. So what are you pledging yourself to Rav for? You're trying to answer this Mishnah on behalf of Rav when you don't even hold like him. Amar le said to him, Lefrusha le de Rav, I'm just doing it in order to explain, to clarify what Rav would say. De Rav hachi metaretz lalamas nisin. This is how Rav would explain the Mishnah. But the Gemara says, Rav kroko amar, but doesn't Rav bring a pasuk? How could you disagree with Rav? The pasuk does seem to say that once he takes the shvua, so the bailam, they have to accept that shvua and he doesn't have to pay. And the Gemara says to that, Amri, they say to that, Kro l'chol ha-nishbon shebetorah. That pasuk is actually used for the following halacha, that any time the Torah says to take a shvua, nishbon v'lo mishalmin, it's talking about taking a shvua and not paying. Meaning to say what we mentioned earlier, the idea that it's always the defendant who takes the shvua, it's never the plaintiff. It's always a shvua that's taken in order to exempt oneself from payment. Again, kol nishbon shebetorah nishbon v'lo mishalmin hu da'asa. That's what the pasuk is coming for. V'lokach ba'olah v'lo yishalem. How do we learn that from the pasuk? Because the pasuk says the owner accepts the shvua and he doesn't have to pay. Misha'olav l'shalem hu nishba. The one who's supposed to pay, he's the one that takes the shvua. That's the defendant. And we will take a look at Tosas over here because it will be relevant to the next question of the Gemara. Tosas say, Eitzvei Rav Achabar Menyume Perish Bekuntras. Rashi explains, the Lo Parach Elamei Reisha, that the question of the Gemara is only from the Reisha, Va'edim Me'idim, where the Edim testify. It's not from the case of Hodah, from admission, because there Rav never said the halacha. By a case of admission, the person would be chayiv, v'lo miseifa. We're not asking from the seifa by admission. Rav never said his halacha by admission. And Tosas say, Ve'ein nira, that doesn't seem to be correct. The Harava Makshal Kamon Behedya Mehoda, because we're going to see Rav is going to ask a question explicitly later on from a case of admission, because we still don't make that distinction between a situation of admission and a situation of edus until later on we're going to make that distinction, and we'll see the Gemara now will ask a question from a case of Hodah. And so the Gemara continues, Meisiv Rav Hamnuna asks a question, and this is also from a Mishnah. Hishbia olav chamisha pa'amim, if a person makes him take a shvua 5 times, bein b'fnei bezin uvein shalo b'fnei bezin, whether in front of bezin, whether not in front of bezin, v'chafar olav, and he denies it each time, chayev al kol achas v'achas, he's going to be chayev the 5th and the karban asham on each and every false shvua. V'yamar Rav Shimon says, Matam, what's the reason? Hoel v'yochol lachzor lahodo, since he's able to admit and make himself chayev, so every denial, every false shvua is another false shvua that can cause a chayev of a 5th and a karban asham. And so over here you have an example, and again this is a question from a case of Hodah, as Tosas pointed out, but the point over here is you see that the person is still chayev, even though he took the shvua. And here you can't say that we're talking about where he takes the shvua quickly before Bezin actually administers the shvua, because he's shbiya olav katani, because it says he's shbiya olav, it sounds like it's administered. And chutz lebezin l'motzas, you also can't say that it's taking place outside of Bezin. Maybe it's his shbiya olav, maybe just the plaintiff told him to take the shvua, but it's not a situation of the Bezin doing it. You can't say that either, because bifnei Bezin katani, it says it was in front of Bezin, and so therefore his shbiya olav in Bezin sounds like it was an oath that was administered by the Bezdin. And the Gemara says to that, who most of love, whom afarakla. He asked the question, but then he answered the question. You could read the Mishnah litzdadin katani. You can read it to its sides. What that means to say is you can break up the phrases and say it as follows: Hishbiya olav chutz lebezin. He made him swear. He administered the oath, but that was outside of Bezdin. It wasn't an oath that was administered by Bezdin. But ubebezin. But when it mentions in the Mishnah that he took the shvua in Bezdin, kafatz, that's talking about where the defendant jumped and quickly took the shvua before the Bezdin actually administered the oath, and therefore we can say we're talking about an oath that wasn't administered by Bezin, and it would not be a question on Rav. And Rashi explains, Chayiv al kolachas v'yachas chomesh v'yashim. He's going to be chayiv on every false shvua 1/5 and the karban asham. Hoel v'yachol lachzor ulahodos, because he's able to admit v'nimtza devechul kofer mammon. So that means in each situation, by every shvua, he could have admitted and been mechayiv himself, and so every single shvua is actually a denial of a real chiyuv of mammon, and therefore we say that he has to do 5 times, a 5th and a karban asham. Again, this is a question on Rav. And then the Gemara said, Hishbiya olav katani, it's clear that the oath was administered. Umidalotani hishbiya shma'amin al yedei dayan. It doesn't say hishbiya. It sounds like the judges are the ones that administer the oath. Hitil olav shvua, they're the ones that make him take the oath. V'kibal al karcha, when he did that against his will. But katani yachol lachzer l'hodos, and it does say that in theory he could admit alma kati memona islay gabe. You see that he still owes money. And then the Gemara answers, Litzdadin katani, you read it to its sides. Hishbiu olav chutz lebezin, means to say the oath was administered outside of Bezin. Diafagav dechayvu bezin shvua. Now the way Rashi understands is Bezin did say that he has to take a shvua, but kevan de michutz lebezin hishbiu, but since it was outside of Bezin that he made him take the shvua, lokanya, that kind of shvua does not create the acquisition. Ubifnei bezin de katani, when it says he took the shvua in front of Bezin, loa hishbiu olav kai, there it's not going on a case where it was administered, that's going on a case of kafatz where he jumped and did it early. He did it ahead of time. So again, that's also not the kind of shvua that is going to create the exemption. And the Gemara continues, Masiv Rava asks a question on what Rav said from the following brisa. Balabayis shatan tainas ganav epikadon. If you have a balabayis who claims that epikadon that he was watching over, that he was responsible for, he claims that it was stolen from him, and therefore he's exempt. V'nish, when he takes a shvua, that's a false shvua. V'hoda, and then he admits that he took a false shvua. Uvo edom, and also edom come and they say that his shvua was false. So we make the following distinction. Imad shalobo edom hoda, if he admitted before the edom came, so then the admission causes the keren chomash v'yasham. So then mishalim keren v'chomash v'yasham, he pays the principal, a fifth, and also brings the carbon asham. V'ima mishabo edom hoda, now if the edom came first and then he admitted, now he does have an admission over here, so he's going to bring the carbon, but since the edom came first, instead of paying the fifth, he's going to pay kefil. Mishalim tashlume kefil v'yasham. He's going to pay the double payment, the kefil payment, and he'll also bring rather the carbon asham. And so the Gemara now asks, now over here in this case, chutz lebezin v'kafatz lo matzas amrit. You cannot answer that we're talking about a shvua outside of Bezdin, or that he takes a shvua early. It's not a shvua that's administered by Bezdin. You can't say that because kefil katani, because it says he pays kefil. You would only pay kefil if it was actually a shvua that was administered by the Bezdin, and yet over here it says that he does have to pay. If he takes the shvua, unlike what Rav said, he's going to have to pay. Again, this is also a question that involves admission over here, and so the Gemara then answers what Rashi really said before and what Tosfos alluded to. Elama Rava, rather Rava says, Kol Hoda, any situation of admission, Loshna Toin Tainas of it, it doesn't matter if the claim he made was that it was lost, meaning the Pikadon was lost, but Loshna Toin Tainas Ganav, it doesn't matter if the claim he made was that it was stolen from him. In both of those, in all of those scenarios, if there's an admission, Lo Amar Rav, there Rav would never say his halacha, Rav would certainly say that he has to pay. Taksiv V'hisvada, it says V'hisvada, talks about admission, the boy Shlume, he certainly has to pay, Karen V'chomesh, he has to pay the principal and a fifth. Toin Tainas Ganav, now in a situation of Toin Tainas Ganav, let's say he claims that it was stolen from him, Uvo Edom, and then Edom come, Nami Lo Amar Rav, Rav didn't say his halacha there either. Dachsiv Tashlume Kefil, because we know it's written that there's a concept of paying Kefil in that case, and so there's no exemption with that shvu as well. Kiko Amar, when did Rav say his halacha? Kagon Shatoin Tainas of it, specifically in a scenario where the Shomer claims that it was lost, Vinishba, and then he takes the false oath, Velohod, and he doesn't admit, rather Ubo Edom, and Edom come, so he doesn't admit, and instead it's Edom that come. In that particular situation, Rav says that the shvua causes a kinyan, so to speak, and means that he is exempt, he doesn't have to pay, even though the Edom came. And the Gemara continues, Azal Rav Gamda v'yamr l'shmaita kami de Rav Ashi. Rav Gamda went and he said over this halacha in front of Rav Ashi, he said the sugi in front of Rav Ashi. Amar Lei said to him, Hashta now, Umar Rav Hamnuna Talmide de Rav, if Rav Hamnuna, who was a student of Rav, V'yoda de Amar Rav Hoda, he knew, he must have known that Rav said his halacha even by admission, even in a situation of admission, when he takes the shul, he's potter. The Kamosiv Hoda, and that's why we saw above, one of the Amoraim who asked the question was Rav Hamnuna, and he asked from a Mishnah which talked about Hoda, which talked about admission. V'yata Amrit Hoda lo Amar Rav, and you're trying to say that Rav did not say his halacha by a case of admission. That doesn't make sense. Why would Rav Hamnuna have asked the question from a case of admission if Rav wasn't talking about that? Amar le Rav Acha Saba Rav Ashi. So Rav Acha Saba said to Rav Ashi, Rav Hamnuna hachi kakashali. Rav Hamnuna, the difficulty that was bothering him was as follows, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Vav Amud Beis.